I'd like to start you guys off with a powerful quote today. Buddha said, "Hatred is never ended by hatred but by love, and a misunderstanding is never ended by an argument but by tact, diplomacy, conciliation, and a sympathetic desire to see the other person's viewpoint." And I say this because a friend of mine recommended that today's video be on the topic of why it's much better to listen to understand one another rather than to just respond. Because oftentimes, you've probably fallen prey to this like I have, you feel me? When you're in a disagreement with someone, your first instinct is to defend yourself. You're like, wait, you're wrong. I'm right. And here's why. But if you've ever acted on that, you've probably found out the hard way that all you've done is create a bigger fire. You've made the situation worse and you deviate from where the original disagreement started. Whereas if you would have sat down and said, hey, I'm listening to you. Tell me how you feel. You intake it all rather than trying to respond to bits and pieces of what they say to get your point out. Be like, you know what? You're actually right. I can see that. I am with you on this. How I said a certain thing made you feel a certain way. You're right. I apologize. And it's crazy how a simple I'm sorry or I apologize can diffuse 90% of disagreements you have with people, especially in romantic relationships where this tends to be very prevalent. There'll be a disagreement that comes up. You'll think, you know what? I don't know how what I said made you feel that way. Obviously, it's wrong. But you shouldn't say that, or you shouldn't go down that path of thinking, because when you're just arguing with someone for the sake of doing it, nobody wins, and you make the situation significantly worse. And that's a surefire way to destroy your personal relationships with other people. And from personal experience, I found that I've been a bit hot-headed sometimes, maybe a bit too stubborn, to where I felt like I was listening to understand. I'm like, all right, tell me how you're feeling. And then once they tell me, I'll sort of break it down in a logical way because my brain goes down the intellectual route of, okay, why do they feel this way? Why did they see this? Okay, this is right, this is wrong. When it's not a matter of right and wrong, it's more so, this is how they feel and what I did made them feel this way. All right, how can we diffuse the situation? I found that that's the best way to go about it, but it's easier said than done. And what I fall prey to, and what you might as well, is you'll read a book like this, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and you'll think that because you've read the book, you just inherently understand the ideas. But it's oftentimes, from my experience, like therapy, in the sense of just because you learned something doesn't mean you have inherently ingrained it into your being. And let me explain what I mean there. Just because you've read a quote like that, like I started this video with, doesn't mean you actually understand it and have put it into practice. Because it goes along with the saying, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you don't actually practice the things you preach, like how I started this book off with, if you don't actually practice seeking to understand one another rather than just trying to respond, you will constantly find yourself in the same loop of ending up in pointless arguments where once the fire's said and done, once it's put out, you realize, wow, they were actually right. I didn't have to say any of that. I didn't even really care to prove my point. I was just doing it just because it was habit. That's happened to me more times than I can count. And it's something I look back on with a bit of regret, I'd say, but it also it's taught me a good lesson. And I should actually practice what I read, practice what you learn, because if you don't, you will just fall back into the person that you were. And I'm pretty sure none of us wants to be the person we were a year ago or 3 years ago, because the point of life is to keep progressing, to keep learning, and to put what you're learning into action. So for instance, the best way you can avoid an argument is to try to understand the other person's point of view. See where they're coming from. Why do they feel how they feel? Don't invalidate how they feel or what they're thinking. Don't tell them that they're wrong, because that only creates more apprehension. That only distances you from them. Rather, say, you know what? I want to hear you out. Tell me exactly how you're feeling, and then seek to go from there. In order to go from there, you have to be honest with yourself. You have to actually listen to them. You have to see, are there areas where I can agree with what they're saying? Instead of just letting your ego take over and think, you know what, I need to defend myself. I need to prove that I'm right and they're wrong. Because you've probably found out the hard way. In the end, you don't win. All right, you've proved your point. And guess what? You've pushed them further away. You've made them more upset with you. And they probably resent you just a little bit. And that's a hard pill to swallow, which is why I myself have been trying to practice this. And honestly, I slip up sometimes. And it hits me. It's almost like the hindsight is 2020, because when you see red, when you get into these arguments, your first instinct is just to defend yourself out of ego. But then when you're able to realize in that moment that this is a chance for you to learn, you're like, wait, I can be different here. I can diffuse this situation if I just shut my mouth and open my ears. Because oftentimes people just want to feel heard. That's really what it is. And when you seek to understand another person's viewpoint, you're actually hearing them out. And you'd be surprised at how difficult a skill that is to master, because most people just talk because they like to hear the sound of their own voice. They're not actually trying to see someone else's point of view. They just want to get their point out. They just want to be right, to fuel their own ego. But no one wins. And I know I've said that a lot, but it's very true. And you probably know it from your day-to-day life, because I've learned it the hard way as well. Nobody wins when you're just seeking to argue with someone, because then it just turns into a debate. It's not even a good debate. It's not even like a political debate. You're just fighting for the sake of it, and you feel like absolute garbage after. It's not fun for anyone involved. I know this video might have gotten a bit redundant, so I'll end it with this. See arguments as an opportunity for you to learn, an opportunity for you to do things differently. Because a lot of us have those old habits of just trying to bicker with a person because we want to be right so bad. But oftentimes, being right means you're going to bring the other person down. You're going to make the situation worse. And deep down, you know you don't want that, because I haven't wanted that, which is why when I've encountered these situations, I feel terrible after, when the hindsight hits in and you realize you didn't care as much about the argument as you think you did. It was just in the moment, you felt like you had to defend yourself. You felt like you had to be right, but you didn't, did you? But all in all, I hope you'll put this into practice, because I feel like if we have more people that are listening to understand one another rather than to just respond, we'd have a much more peaceful world. And macro scale, we'd have a lot less wars, big disagreements, or micro level. You'd be able to save your relationships, maybe with your lover, with your friend, with your family, if you just seek to hear people out rather than just wanting to hear your own voice. Because at the end of the day, what do you gain from being right? Satisfaction for your own ego? We all know what they say. Ego is the enemy, right?